Hello again. In the previous video, we introduced the concept of governance, and we saw how good governance became important in the discussion on foreign aid effectiveness. Well, now we're going to examine how the World Bank, which has as its mission the funding of development programme, how it attempts to measure international differences in the quality of governance. But first, let me start with a little story. In 1982, Daniel Kaufman was awarded his doctorate in economics from Harvard, and he joined the World Bank. Since he'd grown up in Chile in Latin America, his first mission was to the slums of Colombia. And there he witnessed at first hand the paradox of how such wealth and such abject poverty were able to coexist in the same country or in the same city. The answer, he perceived, had less to do with economics than with the abuse of power. Now, missions to Africa serve to reinforce this conviction. But the problem is that the World Bank is an international body under the United Nations. This makes it difficult to openly criticize the political system of a member state. Okay, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kaufman was sent to the Ukraine to help oversee the reforms being put into place following the end of state-directed central planning. And again, he was impressed with the rampant corruption he encountered there. So he and his team began to develop indicators that help define and measure the differences in forms and contexts of corruption. By this stage, Daniel Kaufman had become director of the World Bank Institute, a research body affiliated to the World Bank. And in 1996, it published the first annual World Bank Governance Indicators. Now, Kaufman's tactic was to conceal highly sensitive political questions in technocratic language. In this, he was only partially successful. However, it did allow him and his team to continue. So let's have a look at what these indicators were. There are 6 separate indicators, and they follow the political process from the formulation of policy to its execution and implementation. It's a 3-step process with 2 indicators for each step. Inputs into the policy process are measured by voice and accountability and by political stability and the absence of violence. The process of making and implementing policy is measured by government effectiveness and regulatory quality, and the outputs are measured by the rule of law and control of corruption. The index is scored from +2.5 to -2.5, with 0 representing the world average for that particular year. So those are the indicators. Let's have a look how they're measured now. The first thing to note is they're composite indices. They combine different dimensions into one number. Now, the indicators they use are survey sources. But unlike the World Values Survey, these aren't opinion polls, and they're not random. The sources contain the impressions and the anecdotal evidence of outside elites and NGOs, so a lot depends on their impartiality. So that's the raw material going into the mixture. So we got a mixture of impressions and evidence. Corruption's getting worse, or on average I pay 10% in bribes. So the second step is to put all of these responses into some sort of coded ranked numbers. For example, 1 is good, 7 is bad. And there again, there's another subjective element. Next, the various components need to be weighted for their relative importance. We've already seen some of the problems that can arise from this when we looked at the Human Development Index. Well, Kaufman and his team avoided this problem by not assigning equal weights, but to give extra weights to those observations that clustered close together, and therefore less to outsiders. But this has 3 effects. It makes the whole process less transparent. It places a lot of weight on your confidence in the World Bank team. But thirdly, it does allow for the measurement of statistical error. So let's have a look at this last point. Any statistical example allows for the calculation of a measure of uncertainty or an error term. But the governance indicators are unusual because they actually do so. What it reveals is that especially at the lower end of this spectrum, error margins are surprisingly large. At the interactive site, viewers are shown an outcome of a chosen indicator and its range of error. It's set at a standard 50%. In other words, there's a 50-50 chance that the result lies outside the range. The site also offers the viewers the alternative of a 95% certainty, which shows an even larger range. And there again, there's a 50-50 chance that it lies between those 2 observations. Now, this wider bracket easily covers 10% of the countries surveyed. So it's not really surprising that the World Bank urges caution when using the results. Unfortunately, it's a warning that's all too often ignored. Now, I like the World Bank indicators. Their site gives links to all of the sources used. It's a treasure trove for BA and MA papers. The team's also very quick to address criticism. Some critics call this attitude defensive, but I think it's always better to have two sides of the debate. But that doesn't mean that I don't share some of the criticisms that have been made. The first is that centering the indicators on a different average every year makes the comparison over time very difficult, other than in terms of relative change. The second criticism is that the sources have a bias towards business. The bank would reply that their job is to grow countries, so that this requires a primacy of economic aspects. But trust is not just a question of getting the economics right. And thirdly, the bank is also biased towards market-oriented policies. It doesn't like state enterprises, it doesn't like labour market interventions, which often offer an alternative and viable path to growth. And we'll come back to these criticisms later. Now, one final point. Although the World Bank indices are important as a focus of debate, and in the articulation of policy, the World Bank itself uses a far wider and nuanced range of data when it makes its policy, and its site offers this data free and easily accessible. So let's sum up then. In this video, we've seen how the World Bank came into the business of measuring governance. We saw the structure of the indicators into inputs, processes and outputs, and we looked at how the indicators were constructed and formulated some reservations and criticisms in their construction and their use. Over the next 3 videos, we'll examine in more detail the 3 indicators most used by social scientists: voice and accountability, or democracy, the rule of law, and the control of corruption.